Hi, welcome to my channel where we provide an alternative view to the common narrative. Today I'm going to talk about the Nord Stream sabotage and who done it. And yes, I know another number of people have already talked about it, but like always, I'll provide an alternative view of the common narrative. So if you are interested to watch my view, please continue watching. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about the Nord Stream sabotage and the narrative that goes around it, especially with the recent newspaper articles about there's supposed to be an Ukrainian group of about 6 people that hired a small yacht, and well, they were responsible culprits for the sabotage and not Americans. But before I start about this whole thing, one has to look a little bit. I said I would do it in a previous video, and well, I've done now a little bit of effort to do it. I've done some calculations on a thin-walled pipe, typical use for this application. And as I discussed in my previous videos, according to the information, the wall thickness is about 40 millimeters of steel. It's probably a seamless pipe, and the internal pressure is about 200 bar. Now, then the outside is covered with a thick layer of concrete. Now, a lot of people don't understand the structural integrity of these pipes and the function of this concrete, but the concrete is not a strengthening item. It is more there for corrosion protection. So it's not reinforcing concrete, so it doesn't mean anything. And even if it was reinforced, the contribution to the structural strength of the pipe is nothing, or is absolutely minimal. And concrete itself cannot handle real tension. It is more there for compression. And on the outside of the pipe you get usually tension. Now so you can ignore the concrete part of the pipe. Now, if you look at normal basic ASME code, American standard, I think it's 8.813 or 814, and you do your calculation about that, then you will find for an internal pressure of 200 bar, the design thickness of the wall should be 40 millimeters. So the design and the pressure and the diameter and everything falls into more or less into the engineering design parameters. Well, with a 40 millimeter, the design criteria is about 0.72, which effectively you can say it's about a 28% safe, no, 0.28, well, it was 28% safety factor. But usually between theory and practice, there's a huge difference. And that's why these codes have been developed, because they made provision for welding irregularities, manufacturing irregularities, etc. and etc. You can look at the depth and so on, but that's about 80 meters, and 80 meters is about 8 bar. So technically you can withdraw the 8 bar from the 200 bar and you get, well, 192 bar, but that's not a big difference. That's about 5%. So from a structural point of view, nothing funny. 40 millimeters, not a big safety factor. Effectively, you can easily damage it and rupture it with a not sufficient. You don't need enormous amount of, contrary to the popular narrative, you don't need 100 tons or 100 pounds or thousands of pounds of explosive to rupture this pipe. And the main reason for that is that the pipe was filled with gas and pressurized at 200 bar. So what you have is you have a pressurized cylinder lying, well, not a cylinder, but a pipe, but let's call it a cylinder, at 80 meters down in the sea. Now, if the wall in the steel is already under tension, which is called the hoop stress in this case, then a little bit more of a pressure or a deformation of the shape of the so-called round pipe will create increases in stress at certain areas and decrease in other areas, and you will find the stress will exceed the limits of the material and rupture will take place. Another thing about this, if you look at the photographs, the surfaces where it was nicely ductile failure, nothing brittle, nothing nice, fairly easily, like if the pipe would have burst, that is the surface type you would get from that type of failure. So it was an overstressed type of failure that you saw. And to get that, you don't need hundreds, like I said, 1,000 pounds of explosives. You only need to add a little bit to get it ruptured. And also, if you look at explosives, you can do explosive forming, and explosives explode at a very high propagation rate. It is like if you take a pole, if you do in your garden, you can see it many times. You take a steel pole and you hammer it with a hammer, and you will see that it deforms at the top where you hammer it with. And the reason why is that is when you hammer something at an impact speed or like an explosive speed, although you technically apply a force of say 100 kilogram, the propagation wave inside that can raise the stress level to an effective 200 kilograms. And that is how they use explosive forming, steel forming, where they physically take an explosive and then shape the material. So if you explode this on a pipe which is already stressed, where you need maybe a 50% overstressing for the pipe to burst, and if you think about this, that it is double the stress you can create with a very fast application of the force, which typically happens with explosives, there is no really need for that. And then one also has to consider, how does explosives basically behave underwater? And if you look at that principle, then maybe you can generate a hell of a vacuum or a shock wave, or I'm not totally sure. I'm not an expert on underwater explosion, but I'm sure that there are certain criteria you can use. And then we find also out that the pipe, about 200 meters of pipe is sort of missing. Well, that is typical of what I would expect for a pipe to burst that is under pressure. So you severed it at one point, the gas flow is pressurized, jumps out on the one side like a jet engine, and because the pipe is not a straight line anymore, it's now like a little bit to the edge, it can collapse like a snake or a piece of wire or whatever you want to see it. And on the other side is the gas that is released from the other end might push it forward and deform it a little bit more. And then you can look at currents maybe that can carry away these pieces. And if you use an explosive with an excess of oxygen, just remember, natural gas cannot burn without oxygen. It doesn't have its own oxygen. But if you supply something with gas, and you can turn that gas also into a flammable explosives for the period until all the oxygen has been consumed. So in my opinion, again, it doesn't need a hell of a lot of explosives to destroy. If it wasn't pressured, then okay, it would have been a different site. But it was pressured. And it was pressured at the maximum load, the design load of 200 bar, which only provided them with a safety factor of, say, 28%, which is not a lot. Like I said, because a lot of this 28% is absorbed by manufacturing defaults and just non-uniformity of the steel and the pipes and etc. and etc. etc. So again, I don't believe there's a hell of a lot of explosives that is required. Then nobody really talks about this whole story, that there were 4 pipelines, but only 3 were destroyed. And nobody asks the question is why? Well, if you look at what was destroyed, the 2 Nord Stream 1 pipelines were destroyed. And only one of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was destroyed. And my argument is, number one, is that the Nord Stream 1 pipelines were smaller and less capacity, number one. Number two is the turbines that were used on Nord Stream number 1 were the Siemens version that were basically under sanctions from Canada and couldn't be restored, number 2. So number 3 is the gas supply line to the Nord Stream 1 pipelines were already under pressure and only running at 20% and then later on against nothing because of the turbines. So in effect, they were old, number 1. Number 2 is they were smaller. And number 3 is they had the turbine problems. Now look at Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 used Russian turbines. So if they wanted to supply gas, Nord Stream 2 was open. Nord Stream 2 were bigger, so they can do more flow. And they left intentionally. They didn't destroy one of the Nord Stream 2 pipelines intentionally in order to tell the Germans, listen here, we only decreased your capability of gas supply, but you are in any case diversifying you. We're still leaving you one pipe intact that you can get gas from Russia, and that is a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So if you are ever under pressure to get gas from Russia, hey, we didn't destroy everything. We only destroyed part of it. So it's not that nobody talks about this. Why only 3 were destroyed? And another thing I have about this whole narrative is that this destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline is catastrophic. No, it's not catastrophic. It would have only been catastrophic if it couldn't be repaired. But these pipelines can be repaired if the need arises. So it's not a permanent disablement of a permanent destruction of the possible gas supply from Russia. So if Germany ever decides to reopen connection or relationship with Russia and import gas, they can do it. Well, it will cost a little bit of money, but it's there. And it's maybe going to take 6 months to do it, but the option is there. And the people that are talking about corrosion, no, the pipes are not going to corrode because steel doesn't really corrode under water, especially deep water where there is a lack of oxygen. In order to corrode, you need oxygen, and at the very deep depth, there is very little oxygen. So it will be a very, very slow process. And then also the water is inside the pipe. So the only oxygen that these pipes will have experience is the oxygen that's inside the pipe, and that oxygen will sort of be depleted later on. And then there will be no marine life either, like say you have the cut end and a kilometer further on there won't be any life. It will only stay in the life in the first, say, 100 or 200 meters. But after that it will become impossible for marine life to also exist. So again, these pipes are not critical. So everybody goes on as if it's the end of the world. No, it's not the end of the world. But, and that is the but, this is an international terrorist act. Now, if you want to focus on that, then you have my full support. And that is what I also agree with. It is a terrorist act, and from that point of view, for me, it is a serious event in terms of international relationships and so on. Now, when the explosion started, I made my first video and I talked about, don't always only blame the Americans. There are a number of other alternative actors, of which Poland was one and Ukraine was one. And the reason why Ukraine was one is they always begged the Germans, don't use Nord Stream 2 pipeline because then you're going to get gas from that and I will have no transit fee for all my gas that comes from Russia to you via the Ukrainian pipeline. The Ukraine wanted to have retain their income from this transit fee. This is one of the main reasons what they complained about. So there's no reason to suspect that it couldn't be Ukrainian people that has done a sabotage. There's no reason for that. But if they were Ukrainian people, they would have had the sanctions of the Kiev regime. They would have said yes or no, and it is impossible for a private enterprise to do such an exercise, because firstly, you have to get the necessary people to do it, and secondly, you have to get the necessary explosives to do it. And then the third one, you have to have the necessary cooperation of certain bodies, because certain security agents will get a hint of it and they will find out, and it had to be a fairly secret operation. So if it was Ukrainian people, then Kiev knew about it, and well, that's what they did. Telling also the world that only Americans can do this and have the necessary tech and experience in divers and so on, that's a fallacy. It's like always, only the Americans have super soldiers and super divers. And no. Yes, you cannot go down with natural air cylinders down there. That goes about to 56 meters max. And at 56 meters, you think you are drunk. And that is why it's dangerous for people. And below that, you have to have a helium air type of mixture or oxygen mixture in order to breathe at that depth. And you got to have experience in that. But there are commercial people that do it for a living, that dive that deep. Salvage companies will do that. Oil platform companies will do that. Gas and oil exploration companies will have these people. And then we have the old veterans and so on that were in the Navy, had the experience, and then either became mercenaries or whatever. So there are plenty of people that can dive to 80 meters, no problem. It's when you get to 400 meters and 500 meters, that's where the problem lies. And then you have to have special gears. But the only thing you need on 80 meters is a mixture of air. And there are plenty of private people that can do it. So that's number one. Number two is the Ukrainians have a navy. So they have divers. I mean, South Africa has divers. And South African divers can dive that deep. So what the hell is the problem with the Ukrainians? Nothing. So a lack of technical people and so on, that's a no-no. That's not a problem. So now you don't need that much explosives. Secondly, you have enough people to do this, so no lack of problems there. So what other problems are there? Well, if you look at the Seymour Hersh story, the first time I read it, it sounded like a Alistair McLean, Tom Clancy type of operation. I know people say it was very in detail. Well, the detail is always available. It is common known that in Panama, in Florida, there's a diving school for the Americans, and there's a CIA here, and a CIA room there, and a building there, and yeah, you can figure that out. That's, for me, we don't know about that, but people that live and breathe journalists in America, they will be able to find it out. What amazes me the most things about that, there are actually two things, and I actually mentioned in my previous videos. And the one was that this type of operation, if it was the Americans, needed absolute 100% tight security. That was essential for the whole operation. But it wasn't like that. There were two other sources that came forward, which I explained. The one was a German one, the other one was a Polish person, I believe, that were part of this exercise, and they noticed the divers. That's number one in that. Number two is, This military exercise was not right on top of the pipes. Oh yeah, but besides, you can get sonar that can pick up the pipes at that depth. So even the fourth one, finding the pipes is not a problem. I mean, if you have a normal fish finder, you can see a fish finder and that's it. And you're going to see a line pipe. If you drive long enough, you're going to find a pipe that looks like a line. And that is what you're looking for. But naturally, it would be a little bit more sophisticated than that or more expensive. But that was another point. But we're coming back to the whole story about the ships and the exercise. The military exercise was not on top of these pipes. It was in the vicinity. And sometimes you read some of the reports and they talk about it was 50 kilometers away or it was 200 kilometers away. Well, what's the point of that? You take a huge ship and drop the supposedly thousands of tons of pounds of explosives, and or you have to transfer it via a dinghy, inflatable rubber duck type of, and it's loaded with the explosives with 4 men or two divers and the support people, or 5 men. And then 1,000 pounds of explosives on a normal inflatable, then travel 30, 40 kilometers away from the main ship until you're on top of the pipes, which you don't have the equipment because you are on a inflatable. So all this fancy equipment that you had, which is on the main ship, is suddenly not available, and you're on no, it doesn't work like that. You see the loopholes. And according to the eyewitnesses that I mentioned from Germany, and I don't think it was Polish, it was Norwegian or Swedish, but another source. They talked about that they saw these guys getting into an inflatable boat and driving 40 kilometers in a different direction. So no sonar. Not a boat that can take 1,000 pounds of explosives, plus all the diving equipment. And remember, those have got 3-4 bottles on top of them, and it's mixtures of gas. So it's heavy and it's bulky. And then you put it on inflatable. And then you move away from your main ship. And then you go down. No, that doesn't make sense. What makes more sense, actually, is the story about this yacht. Nobody will look at the yacht. Yacht is a recreational type of thing. You don't need 1,000 pounds of explosives. You could have done a little bit less, maybe 200 kilograms or like that maximum. You could have done all the diving equipment, and if anybody stops you, I'm going to go diving. Nobody's going to question that. You have your whole personnel on board, your support personnel, and you have your so-called sonar or whatever to pick up the pipes. So that's much more a plausible type of explanation or a vehicle to use for this type of venture. So the only thing we have about Seymour Hersh's article is one thing. And that is the reputation of Seymour Hersh. And that is why we have to believe him, because he has a reputation for that. But who gave him the information? An unnamed official. Who gave the information for these newspaper articles? Unnamed officials. So the source is more or less also unknown in both cases. So it doesn't mean much. And who says that Seymour Hersh has the integrity is not violated? He doesn't lie, but he's fed wrong information. You know, they're playing Seymour Hersh. I don't want to believe the yacht story. I would like to believe Seymour Hersh. You could argue it's about a cover story in order to deflect attention away from Seymour Hersh's article. That you can argue. And one can, if one looks at it superficially, then you can agree with that. And it seems to me the Russians are also supporting the deflection type of thing. Well, then there's the other thing is that Rolf Scholz recently went to Washington, unaccompanied by anybody, and had a 1-hour session with Biden. Thereafter, a news conference, departed back to Germany, and then the articles came out. And now there's a hell of a lot of speculations. What went on in this room? Nobody of us knows what went on. I can present an argument and say, listen here, like the normal narrative. Olaf Scholz went to New York and spoke to Biden. Listen, Biden here, I know you did the pipes at the sabotage, but I'm in trouble. If I don't give, there's a growing anti-American perception or movement growing in Germany, and you have to help me and get an alternate deflector information, otherwise I'm going to lose my job. That's the normal narrative that's now being currently spread. And then Biden would say yes, and then we'll instruct the media and leak some information, and then we have the alternative story. Or the alternative could be that Biden said, called Olaf, and Olaf went and said, listen here, Olaf, we had nothing to do with the sabotage. Nothing. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to say it face to face so you can see I'm not lying. We had nothing to do with it. It can also be in a story. It's also that we have investigators that found the yacht. And no, they didn't find the culprit's passport lying around. That's not what they found. And even if they found some documentations or some that was signed by certain people, and if you hire a car, you've got to show your ID and stuff like that, and then copies are made of your ID before you can lease the car, rent the car, whatever you want to call it. So that documents might be available, but they turned out to all to be false. So it's now known that the identities that were used are false. So they have no value. But we don't know. None of us are investigators, and none of us are in the scene, and none of us are capable of asking the questions. But it's not some government official that has made it available. It is the investigative team somewhere has made something available. And, then I don't know how many points I have now. So the Americans always said, Nord Stream 2 pipeline will never work. It will never go into production. We will destroy it, and we will have means and all this other stuff. So the focus obviously points to America. Well, then the question arises, why were only 3 pipelines destroyed? And why was the 2 Nord Stream 1 destroyed and not the 2 Nord Stream destroyed, and one of the Nord Stream 1 has been kept alive or intact? If America wanted to destroy all 4 of them, for that matter. So things don't make sense. Now, I fully support the Russian thing that there must be an international investigation. And until that investigation has happened, we as commentators and news can actually say nothing. All I have is a lot of questions and alternative narratives with the same information that is available for the open source. None of us can really say what happened. And everything else is speculations. But whatever information narratives there are, none of them make sense to me. They have a lot of loopholes in them. And I'm sure I forget 1 or 2 on other points as well that will try to, that don't fit. Oh yeah, The Russian, when they blew up the Kursk bridge, then they found those places where the whole planning was done for the sabotage of the whole Kursk bridge. And then they made available that they found documents, British documents, or documents from British Navy that assisted the Ukrainians in blowing up the Kursk bridge, but also that they planned the Nord Stream pipeline explosion. So what happened to that information? Is that now false? Did the Russians lie? No, I don't believe so. They didn't lie. And then we have Liz Trust message. Sorry, that's a no-no. That's not even, but I know a lot of people made a huge story out of that, but it has no credible value. It has no value whatsoever. So forget about that one. But that documents from the Russians, that bothers me significantly. And just if you believe that document and that finding, then you have to question Seymour Hersh's article as well. Not Seymour Hersh per se as a persona, no, but the information that was fed to him. Now there's another narrative also going around by my nice friends there, and you should know by now, but I'm not going to talk about these people anymore, is that the Americans are now trying to, or the news media is trying to make it so now that Biden is basically losing credibility. It's a little bit hard to believe because we already lost all credibility, but that's beside the point. And they're now turning back on the American administration, and they are now warning the powers in be, but some diplomatic indirect talk. Zelensky, you're not that support anymore because of this knowledge and so on. We sort of planted false information in order for your relationship with Germany to be damaged and stuff like that. I'm sorry, man. This is all, no. That's all narratives, fictional thinking. I can't understand that people even talk about this. They create these narratives of fiction. Are we writing fiction or are we reporting the news? I don't know. But I know a lot of you viewers support this guy's channel. So, it's all right with me. It's not bothered, doesn't bother me. But you should treat it for what it is. So, in my opinion, who has done it? The Nord Stream power. It's still at that, I would say, that thing is still out. That story hasn't been concluded. Seymour Hersh, yes, most believable story, but lots of loopholes. The alternative story can be considered as possible deflection, but it's not that bad. Yacht would have made sense for me. In any case, you have to decide for yourself. I'm still waiting for the international investigation. And that would be interesting if it is allowed. I understand that they want to do it in the Security Council, and the Russian request is always delayed and postponed, meeting, postponed. So for some odd reason the Russians can't get it submitted. Is that the right English word? Yeah, okay. But it will be done, so it would be quite interesting. Just don't think that it is a terrorist act. Totally. But from a gas supply line, it's not a catastrophic event. Can be repaired if they wanted to. There is a backup system. There is still one pipeline going. If Germany needs gas, it will get it gas. So, you're going to have to leave your back door open a little bit. And that is what Germany was given. Back door. Any case. That's my story for today. If you liked it, subscribe if you haven't. Tell your friends if you haven't. Press the like button. Press the notification bell. And until next time. Cheers.